I'm Jason Lewis.
I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a group of concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. For those who want something to look forward to in their inbox, head over to our website, climateoptimist.co, and sign up for our newsletter. It offers timely insights on solving the climate crisis and ways to make a difference. Stuff I think we all need these days.
Yeah, undoubtedly. So this year, the world has watched conflict unfold on the global scale. The US-Israel war with Iran has had myriad effects, including many implications for the climate. The shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz, the world's busiest oil and LNG supply route, immediately influenced the global energy market. Geopolitical stress and rising electricity demand are coalescing to create a perfect storm, and many countries are facing dire impacts like soaring energy costs and rationing measures. So today, we're going to be discussing resulting challenges in the global energy market, from fossil fuel pricing to the rise of renewables to challenges on the horizon. But before we get to today's guest, let's talk a little bit about this week's Reason for Hope.
Thanks, Flora. The largest wind farm in the US just came online in New Mexico. It'll be 3.6 gigawatts in capacity, or enough to power 1 million US homes and probably 2 million European homes. The project includes a 550-mile high-voltage DC transmission line to move the power from New Mexico to cities in Arizona and California. It was originally planned as an AC line, but they finally made it DC to try and reduce efficiency losses, which I think is fantastic, and we should be seeing more of them. In addition to cutting emissions, the project will deliver $1.3 billion for local governments, schools, and landowners over its lifetime. And despite the efforts by the Trump administration to slow clean energy developments, especially offshore wind, the economic realities of solar and wind now mean that, despite their best efforts, they will continue to be the dominant generation sources for years to come.
Yeah, it was a great piece of good news. I think we've all gotten used to in the last year seeing, these headlines about another offshore wind farm being delayed or developers actually being paid not to build a wind farm. So pretty cool to see a wind farm of this size, just massive, coming online and delivering clean power to the Southwest and beyond.
Yeah, really, really much needed right now.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm absolutely stoked for them that, I've worked on projects of this magnitude, but I'm glad that one's finally come online in the US, and I've actually got a serious case of FOMO here that I wasn't involved in the project.
Very apropos transition there, because our guest today is Daan Walter, a principal at Ember, which is a global energy think tank whose focus lies in accelerating the clean energy transition with data and policy. And in fact, Dan himself specializes in strategy research on the future of energy, from the rapid growth of electrotech to its strategic implications. Before working with Ember, Dan was a principal at RMI, as well as a co-founder and leader of McKinsey's sustainability analytics team. He holds a graduate degree in nuclear energy and a graduate degree in theoretical physics from the University of Cambridge, in addition to his bachelor's degree in physics and astronomy from the University of Amsterdam. We're very excited to have him on the episode today.
Yeah, I don't know how you could get an educational background that's much more sciencey than that. Well, Dan, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
So excited to get into the topic at hand, but we always like to start people off with the same question, which is, when it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
There are many things that make me hopeful, but one of the biggest things this moment that makes me optimistic, hopeful, and excited, thrilled about what is happening in energy today is the extent to which we see a consumer-led revolution right now. So
Okay.
energy, if we go back even 5 or 10 years ago, is very much like centralized utilities, centralized governments. But increasingly, we see now, because people can just go to the supermarket and buy their own solar panels in many economies around the world, they can just buy batteries, balcony solar, balcony batteries, these kind of technologies that you can just install yourself. That gives consumers themselves the power to actually drive the energy transition from home. And we are seeing this actually on the ground playing out in the world, across the world right now. One of the most exciting stories at the moment that your viewers might or might not know of, in Pakistan, where power prices kept rising because the government looked into very expensive coal, fossil, and LNG power specifically. And so consumers basically said, well, we don't like that, so we're going to buy our own solar panels, and en masse bought solar panels and batteries and now other electrified technologies to basically take their energy future into their own hands. And this is something that we should get very excited by, because it means that the number of actors, or how hard it is to stand in the way of this revolution, becomes harder and harder, the more actors can actually decide for themselves rather than be dependent on centralized infrastructure to do it for them.
Almost like a democratization of energy. The individual has a say where they didn't before.
Exactly. And interestingly, in that as well, we see similar to what we saw happening with smartphones and cell phones in emerging economies, where they leapfrogged developed economies. Exactly the same thing we're now seeing happening with electrotech, these new electric technologies. So, wind and solar, but also electric vehicles and other electric technologies and batteries. We actually see a lot of emerging economies that are currently leapfrogging, for instance, the United States on solar uptake or on electrification or on EV sales, because these countries are just basically going directly towards a system that suits their lives much better, which is decentralized and democratized rather than centralized and coming from a single authority.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm all for, folks being able to, control their energy destiny. Well, let's get into, our topic. Obviously, folks are all aware of the conflict that's, happening in Iran, and, the impact that's having on, things like the price of oil. Wanted to kind of set some context though first. What are we seeing in terms of price increases on oil, natural gas as a result? And, how does that kind of vary based on geography?
So we're currently in probably the largest oil crisis the world has ever seen. It is not an oil crisis that we should look at in isolation. It is very important to understand it in its context. So even though it might be the largest in history, and we might think we have very little to compare it to, there's actually a lot to compare it to. So the first big realization one needs to have about the current fossil crisis is that it's the second one in 4 years. So 4 years
Right.
ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, massive price spikes of gas across the world as Europe got cut off from Russian gas, but oil prices also went up. Coal prices went up as a result. Europe started to buy internationally, started to buy gas, and drove up prices across the world for fossil fuels. And this is now the second crisis that hit. Prices are again going up quite dramatically, although one has to say the paper markets, right? The actual price that you now go, if you go to Google and you type in oil prices, you might find something around $90 to $105 per barrel, are incredibly low compared to the size of the crisis, as most experts believe it is.
Okay.
That is largely because the markets are responding to a strategic release of fossil reserves around the world, particularly oil reserves around the world. Already on the physical market, so the actual markets, if you go out there and you want to get an actual barrel of oil delivered to your house, you should be thinking about $150 per barrel already today, even though the paper value of that, like the value that you see when you sort of Google this, might be as little as like $90 per barrel.
Interesting. And as we're kind of watching this play out, those strategic reserves, so countries that have, fossil fuels set aside, right? Like in the US, we have all this oil underground that gets pumped out. What are those reserves looking like? It sounds like people are trying to dampen the impact, but I assume those are finite supplies.
Exactly, Jason. And this is exactly the fear currently in the market is the prices for oil, these paper prices seem to be so low as there is a continued belief, it seems to be in the market, that the Hormuz Strait will open. That will lead to a very rapid return to flows of oil out of the Gulf region. And that will actually reset the oil market before we run out of reserves. we do need to, of course, check ourselves here on our Western street line perspective of looking at this energy crisis. We're incredibly rich in America. We're incredibly rich in Europe. And so
Right.
we have the ability to pay for $4 or $5 per gallon gas, right? We don't like it, but we have the ability to pay for it.
Sure.
Many countries across Asia at the moment are already shuttering because there simply isn't enough energy for these Asian countries to actually make ends meet in their energy system. And
Wow.
so this is already leading to a major disaster there. And even if tomorrow magically the Strait of Hormuz reopens and we actually see the flow of traffic return, it's going to take at least a month or two for normal traffic to return on oil and gas.
In other words, there's this substantial lag. So even if we, open the taps up to get that supply, that new supply back out distributed, through refineries takes time.
Exactly. This lag that protected us now for the first couple of months is the similar kind of lag that will harm us in a few months, even if the strait would reopen.
Well, and great point about, us having an awareness here in the West that some countries, have fewer resources. And so a higher price, when it comes to energy is much more damaging to, sort of day-to-day life.
And I think there's an important point here for us to realize in the West. What's really happening here is prices at the moment are high because we're effectively pricing out mainly Asian energy consumers. This is not prices are high because we need to drill deeper somewhere or because we need to tap into new resources. This
Right.
is purely a game of of musical chairs, right? We set up the room with 100 chairs, 100 barrels per day, 100 chairs, and now with Hormuz we took out at least 10 chairs. And so now the question is, who doesn't get to sit on a chair? And so
Right.
all of this price hike at the moment has nothing to do with actual sort of the fair price of oil going up in that sense, right? Or that it's more expensive to get this stuff out of the ground. It is purely a question of how much am I willing to bid to outbid an Asian farmer, for instance, to run their tractors across their land. And as an American, I'm willing to pay $4 or $5 per gallon. And so I can price them out of the market so they face energy poverty and I do not.
Yeah. So, wondering, you've written a piece recently or co-written a piece, talking about kind of how talk about economic growth through time and how that was historically kind of linked to fossil fuels and how things evolved with sort of the last oil crises, which some folks may not remember back in the 70s. Wondering if you could talk just briefly about that.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the reason I started 5 minutes ago. I framed this as like two oil shocks that have now hit, is because it should remind us of something, right? The twin oil shock. We all know this concept of the twin oil shock, and that's the twin oil shock of the 70s. And so we argue in this report that the best way to understand today's oil shock is to actually go back to the 70s and understand what happened then. But I can quickly give an overview of just the 70s oil crisis, maybe to start with.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So in 1973 is the first major oil shock in the world. After the Yom Kippur War, you get a large oil embargo of oil exports from the Middle East. And then only a few years later, in 79, there is the overthrowing of the Iran regime, and you actually get the Iranian Revolution, and you get again an exclusion of oil supply from the Iranians to the rest of the world, which is the second oil shock. In both of those, oil prices going up very rapidly. This was shuttering of the economy. Even countries like even developed and rich countries like Britain had 4-day work weeks because there simply wasn't enough energy to keep the economy running. These shocks really changed how the world thought about their energy supply, like fundamentally. Before the 70s, you basically see an exponential curve of growth of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels grow, gas, coal, everything. You see in the first shock in 73, you start seeing sort of we would call it a pause. People are kind of have some doubts about whether it's still a good idea to keep growing with fossil fuels. But because it was just sort of one shock, it was easy still to pass off as a politician or as a pundit as a one-off event, something that
Sure.
wouldn't happen again. And this is, of course, what then changes in 79 in the second oil shock. And so in the 70s, you see the rise of effectively countries looking for alternatives for oil and fossil fuels in their economy. And so it's exactly around this point that you see, for instance, the decoupling of fossil demand from GDP, where actually electricity keeps rising and people start to electrify more. And France, of course, powers that, for instance, with nuclear power. And you see across the world,
Right.
people starting to find ways with hydro dams and other solutions to fuel that electricity boom. with a sort of independent sovereign power that sits at home. And so since 1973, basically our per capita fossil fuel consumption in the world has not increased since 1973.
So thinking about those events in the 70s and sort of fast forwarding, to what occurred with the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Iran, what what lessons can we take from that?
So I think perhaps two lessons. One we can draw at high level: an economic lesson and a psychological lesson. The economic lesson is simple, which is if supply gets constrained for a certain fuel, countries will start looking for alternatives. In the 70s, we only had nuclear effectively as alternative, and nuclear was slow to scale. It was still a small industry, and it came from a low base, and it required high tech investments that many countries weren't able to do.
Right.
Nevertheless, it is exactly in this period where we see, for instance, power generation from oil peaking and starting to decline, and nuclear power starting to increase and to some extent come in its stead. So this is the period where you see new technologies that, even if they're not fully competitive yet, like nuclear was, get a huge boost because of the national security concern. So that's, I think, lesson one from the 70s. The second, I think, is the psychological impact of having to go through two shocks in quick succession, right? So
Right.
the first shock, you see it across statistics, the first shock kind of slows down the growth of certain fossil fuels, of certain uses of fossil fuels. It's in the second shock that really you see the change happening. And that, I think, is just something that sometimes as energy analysts we kind of overlook, is that there's an economic component to this, but there's also a psychological component to this. If you just dealt with an oil shock 5 years ago and there's yet another one now that is pricing you out of the energy system, that does something to you as a country, as a person, as a household, that makes you just more wary to go deeper. And so that's exactly what we see across these statistics in the 70s, is that this is not something where, for instance, exponential growth turns into decline in 1973 in the first oil crisis, but it's very clear that kind of it plateaus after the first crisis, and in the second one we actually see sort of the follow through of countries and of companies to opt for new energy. And this is, I think, the main lesson, these two lessons we should take to today, because today also in many ways is very different from the 70s. The main way that it's different is that in the 70s, we only had nuclear energy in its infancy ready to scale as an alternative to fossil fuels. Today,
Totally.
we have major industries already set up in solar and in wind on the supply side, in batteries to balance the system, but also batteries into cars for electric vehicles, heat pumps for heating. These are already today major systems that already have a serious market share and have already, even before these crises started, have already been growing on exponential curves around the world. So I think there's lessons to be drawn from the 70s, but it's also, I think, an important point to recognize that how different today is, because we now have better solutions.
And given that, are we already seeing, indications, not just obviously at the consumer level, like you spoke about, like in Pakistan, but are we seeing, countries make changes to sort of their long-term planning around energy?
Yes, this is what excites us at the moment. So we're seeing it, we can see it in two ways, the change happening here. We see policies across Asia and Europe. So Europe and Asia together make up 90% of global imports of fossil fuels. So basically between Asia and Europe, that's the vast majority of the fossil importing markets.
Interesting.
In both of those, we see very aggressive policies on getting rid of imported fossil fuels. Of course, Europe was very hardly hit by the Ukraine crisis, and now the Hormuz crisis is hitting Asia very hard. Asia got most of the energy coming out of the Strait of Hormuz went to Asia. So they're now very targeted. So we see across the board pushes for solar programs across Indonesia, programs to actually rethink the whole LNG plan that the Vietnamese government has made, that Bangladesh was planning to do. Obviously, we talked about the Pakistan example already, which is, I think, the second element that's very exciting, is that we're seeing actually consumers already, people on the ground already making decisions even before governments have made integrated comprehensive plans yet. We track in Ember export statistics of solar panels and batteries and electric vehicles coming out of China. And since the start of the crisis, we've seen those numbers boom. So we're talking about like as much as doubling of solar export capacity of solar panels going into the world, particularly to
Wow.
emerging economies, as consumers themselves are just basically weighing up how expensive it is to keep buying electricity from the grid with fossil power, or keep running on a moped that runs on diesel or gasoline, which price is going up.
Right.
And they're doing the maths, and they go, I can also go on Alibaba and order a solar panel for $100, and then I'm set.
Right. Yeah, that's wild, and I'm sure that with the price spikes, right, the payback period was already, a short one for many places in the world, and now with these prices, I'm guessing the payback period for, let's say a solar panel and a battery has shrunk dramatically.
Exactly. Payback period is a big contributor now. The fact that you can now suddenly, for consumers, see payback within less than a year, or maybe in a year or two, that lies much more in the time horizon that consumers think about than sort of like 10 or 15-year cost parity moments, right? It's much stronger if you could say you get payback very quickly. The other element that we should underappreciate, which is also very interesting, is the modularity of these technologies, particularly, for instance, of solar and of batteries. I can
Okay.
start with just a small solar panel and a small battery for $20 and already get going. And then all the savings I get from that, I can then turn into adding another solar panel to it and another. And I think that's also a major component, specifically in emerging economies here, where families can get started with a much smaller budget already to start seeing those savings already today, rather than having to wait and save up, a few hundred or even $1,000 before they can install a full system on their roof. You can always start with a small panel and then expand from there.
Yeah, great point. So it's like, maybe I'm in a country like, let's say, Philippines, and I've put up an initial panel, and now I'm, able to charge all my key electronics. And then to your point, with those savings, then all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe I can shift some of my cooking over to electric, or, heating over to electric, or, cooling, et cetera.
Exactly, exactly. And so there's this exciting moment where these end use technologies like the electric cookers and the scooters and TVs as well, and this stuff is all falling in cost, and has been falling in cost quite dramatically over the past decade. But now there's this great thing that on the supply side, you no longer have to wait for the government to make the decision to say, okay, we're going to supply you power and it's going to be affordable. With just little as $50 extra, you can supply that additional power. So you buy your TV plus an extra solar panel and off you go. And now you're basically self-sufficient again.
Interesting. Well, and exciting to hear. Well, you mentioned this already. I'm wondering, we're talking about, energy generation and storage in the form of, like solar and battery, for instance. How is this impacting, or this crisis impacting, let's say, like EV adoption, whether that's like electric, scooters, e-bikes, to electric cars? Are we seeing a change already?
Yes, we're starting to see it. Things take a little bit more time because, of course, electric vehicles sit a little bit downstream from the batteries, etc. So, in the trade data that we track on a monthly basis, we do see the starting of like the surge of EV exports or battery exports out of China. So this is already happening across the world. And we should realize also that we've already come a long way. Global EV rollouts, EV cars around the world, and EV trucks and 2 and 3 wheelers, they're already offsetting about 2 million barrels per day of oil demand.
Wow.
Just to put that into context, that is more than the export of oil from Iran was before this war started.
So as we see all these things kind of taking shape, and obviously the longer the strait is closed, the more inertia those gain. Wondering, as you're looking at the different countries out there, what kind of recommendations would have in terms of, energy policy, right, to help insulate themselves from future fossil fuel shocks?
So there's a wide range of sort of detailed country recommendations that we also have on our website in a response. But I would like to sort of summarize, sort of zooming out at 4 items that we think are just very important to realize across the world right now. The first one is that policymakers need to use this crisis to sweep away the regulatory undergrowth that was stymieing growth of new energy. So across
Okay.
the world, we've seen a slow grid expansion, NIMBYism, all of these inhibitors to change. Crises give policymakers now the mandate to actually intervene and actually take big actions where before maybe they didn't have the political capital to do so.
Totally.
In doing so, it's incredibly important that we prioritize electrification, not just generation of electricity. The rest of the world has seen a continued trend of more and more electrification of society, more electric vehicles, electrified industry, etc. In the West, so both in the United States and Europe, electrification stagnated around 2008. We need to change that. And that's another second thing. If we want to counter this crisis, you need to focus on electrification, because it's in electrification that you can de-risk most of your imports. So there are many interventions you can do to push electrification around the world, but one of the most effective one is just economics 101. Get the price of a product down if you want people to use more of it. And so
I like
very important around the world is to get the price of electricity down, to make it just more attractive to electrify, and make it just harder to make the business case to continue the business as usual in the fossil system. And I suppose the last one I think that's important is to realize in the 70s, we came together in the world, and we founded, for instance, the International Energy Agency to think about where energy is actually going. Actually, keep track, like publicly available statistics for every country of how much energy is being consumed, how much is being stockpiled, etc. This moment may ask for a similar approach, but now not on just tracking what is happening, but actually a sort of an international energy agency for the phase out of fossil fuels, and coming together and actually starting tracking the full value chain of these new technologies, from mining all the way to deployment, to make sure that we can get an accelerated pace across the world in a collaborative way across countries to roll out this new electric future.
Makes sense. Well, we've covered a ton of ground here, Dan. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. Wondering, as people are hearing this and saying, well, yeah, I want to be part of helping us accelerate our transition away from fossil fuels, but what can I do? Interested in any thoughts you have there, right? Like if somebody, is sort of concerned, but isn't an energy expert, are there places for them to plug in that can help, accelerate this transition?
So today, I think the most direct way to participate in this energy revolution is to participate. And so there's a lot of advice you'll hear on elect the right people and go out there and make your voices heard. And these are good pieces of advice. But there's increasingly just now the possibility to vote with your wallet and actually go out there and get balcony solar for your house, get an electric vehicle, try to purchase green power from your grid. This is no longer a large cost plus to your current way of living. It is a great way to send a market signal to the world saying, listen, I'm not happy with how the energy market is currently organized. I'm not happy. I need to wait for maybe even a centralized utility in your city to finally decide to build that solar farm. So I'm going to take it into my own hands and get my own energy supply to show to the world, listen, I'm participating in this energy revolution.
I like it. Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate, hearing about sort of the complexities here, but yeah, I'm encouraged by, this momentum of change that we're starting to see and where it could lead us. Silver linings are always a good thing, and I suspect that, we're going to be in a better place, especially if we, can be deliberate about the decisions we make going forward. So, thanks, Dan, for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
Well, definitely enjoyed the conversation with Dan. Not just informative, but very hopeful. It's just nice to see where the momentum is taking us, and sort of a silver lining for this unnecessary war. What about you guys? What were your takeaways listening to Dan?
I'm with you. I thought it was such a wonderful interview, and he really covered a lot of the things that I would have had, ongoing questions about. But there were definitely some topics that I still wanted to deep dive, including the fact that he spoke to some of the Asian countries that are suffering from the price hike and also the closure of the strait. And so I did a bit of research into that and was definitely, surprised and not surprised to find that following the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the Bank of Japan, for example, raised their interest rate to the highest since 1995. And
Wow.
that's coming from the world's fourth largest economy. But even there, 90% of the crude oil supply in Japan comes directly from the Middle East. So there's, obviously a large dependency in that sense. And they certainly weren't the only country. The South Korean won actually matched its lowest ever exchange rate against the dollar this year. And the last time that they were forced to do that was during 2008's global financial crisis. So gives you a bit of an idea of the magnitude we're talking about here. And
Totally.
Yeah. And back in March, Philippines presidents declared a national energy emergency. So we're definitely seeing kind of this, or have seen this year, this double whammy of the oil price going up while exchange rates had already been incredibly weak. But Jason, we spoke to this a little bit earlier. There's clearly more to the story here. I'm wondering if you'd like to elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, for those of us in the U.S., it's worth kind of taking into account the stark differences when it comes to fossil fuel resources. Right, the U.S. has these bountiful resources. Right, we're a huge exporter. The world's largest in terms of fossil fuels. Asia is sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Mm,
And when I say Asia, in the sense like India, China, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, only 4% of the world's global reserves of fossil fuels. And as a result of that, and this is actually data from another Ember report, they
mm,
import over $1 trillion in fossil fuels per year, which is just massive. So,
mhm,
that reality was already here before this crisis. And so, Asian countries had already been leaning into clean energy. You look at, electrification.
mm,
Southeast Asia, overtook the US in 2023, and overtook us on EV sales back in 2024. So they were already, given the fact that they're a huge importer of fossil fuels, trying to take steps to move away from that, and insulate themselves. And you can see how this crisis is just going to, put that on steroids, right? You've got
yeah.
everybody knows that China being this juggernaut when it comes to producing solar panels, batteries, wind turbines. But again, worth putting some of this stuff in statistics. Like when you look at Asia as a whole, 95% of the world's solar panels, 85% of the world's batteries, and 75% of the world's wind turbines come out of Asia. And if you pull China out of that, Asia still outproduces the rest of the world in solar and battery components. So
Mm,
they were already moving in this positive direction. And
mm,
to Dan's point, it's just you can't see anything but this just accelerating that transition. You take Europe and their reliance on Russia natural gas prior to the war in Ukraine, and now you've got 6 years later they're looking to move completely away from dependence on Russian natural gas. So it's easy to see how this crisis for Asia could be that similar turning point, right? Where it takes them from moving in the right direction to just, racing in the right direction. What about you, Thomas? Thoughts from your end?
I think it's made a bit of a mockery of the whole position of Donald Trump trying to punish China, where now he's basically handed China the keys to the energy future because, as you just said, they
mm,
make all the batteries, all the solar panels, all the solar inverters, and the electric cars. So it's kind of come back to bite him a bit in that situation. But I think there is that thing that, Flora and you and I discussed earlier, where we've got to watch that these efficiency improvements that are made because of the electrification of everything don't end up in further environmental destruction
mm,
beyond just CO2 emissions. So, sure, we might start curbing CO2 emissions, but when you make driving a car 4 times cheaper than it is today on fossil fuels, there is that risk that we end up doing more of it. So we end up destroying more habitat to build more urban sprawl, to build more freeways, because driving a car becomes so cheap. So instead of building dense walkable cities, we start building more sprawling developments into farmland, which then forces farmland to get pushed into forest land and other animal habitats. So it is something that we're going to have to keep in mind. And I'm a big fan of when you make those efficiency savings at the same time, that's when you instate the required environmental protections to make sure that there aren't adverse impacts from those savings and being able to make transportation cheaper.
I was gonna, give you a hard time there initially when you started talking. I thought, Thomas is being a Debbie Downer here. We got this positive thing that's potentially happening. But you're completely right. Like, we don't wanna lose sight of the end goal, which is that, the best case of all is that we're not consuming fossil fuels, but we're also consuming fewer resources, and treading
Mhm,
lighter on the planet is a benefit for all of us. This offers governments an opportunity, right, to take
mhm,
some of those measures. Efficiency, you know, grew dramatically after the oil, price shocks of the '70s. Maybe
mhm.
to your point, Thomas, this is an opportunity to lean into, really expanding sustainable transportation in cities. So, yeah, good point.
Oh, I'm so with you. I was looking into an article by BBC that spoke with Alicia Garcia Herrera, who's the chief economist for Asia Pacific, and it just provides some context for the scale of this and the scale of the opportunity that we have right now. She noted that the '70s oil shocks severely affected prices and also only cut global supply by 5 to 7%. Whereas the current crisis is affecting about 20% of the world's supply. So it's just this massive opportunity for change. And I really hope that we see some governments head in the right direction.
Yeah, I know it's easy to get kinda lost here in the US where,
Hmm.
certainly prices have gone up and people aren't happy about it. But to your points earlier about what's going on in Asia, it seems like it's just on a far greater scale, right?
Yeah.
Talking about, businesses not being able to operate or operating fewer hours. I know Thomas, Australia, as you've talked about before, is pretty dependent on fossil fuel imports. Like,
Mm.
is price of fuel substantially more there?
Yeah, so it did go up initially massively, like um, gasoline or petrol as we call it here, and diesel almost doubled.
Wow.
But the the difference is we could afford to go and buy things on the open market. It's poorer countries are the ones that really struggled. So our prime minister jumped on a plane, flew around Asia, and started locking up fossil fuel reserves immediately and arranging trade deals with gas. And so although there was that price spike, the price now is below where it was because they also reduced the road tax. We pay a lot more road tax per liter than you guys do. We pay the equivalent of $2 a gallon. Or 50 cents
Oh,
a
wow.
litre for road tax. So they halved the road tax,
Mm.
which I was really disappointed by, because it slows that transition, right? If you don't have that financial incentive, it slows the transition to other means of transportation. On a brighter note, though, what has happened here for the first time that I can ever remember is that there's been a decoupling between the oil price and the electricity price. So, just coincidental at the same time, well, actually, a few months before this started, the federal
Mhm.
government announced a battery rebate program where basically you could go and put a battery in your house and the government would pay for about half the battery. Well, the government wasn't paying for it. It was through this STC program where basically it becomes a levy on future electricity bills. Anyway, what it's done is it's created a great big sponge to soak up that excess solar problem that we have in the middle of the day. And it's forcing
Right.
off oil, gas, and other fossil fuels off the grid in the morning and evening.
Mm.
And so, what that's done is create this decoupling between the fossil fuel price and electricity prices in general. They didn't adjust any taxation on electricity, but it now is lower than where it was at the start of this whole oil crisis.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think coming back to your point just a moment ago, Thomas, I think this is that opportunity for policymakers to choose the path, right? Like, you can pull back your road taxes, you can try to, provide this sort of initial relief, or you can pursue a cure, right? You can
Hmm.
Exactly.
Well, going back to Dan's point, it's like before it was nuclear, right? Now
Mm.
we've got solar and wind and batteries, and the stuff's modular, right? You can go buy a solar panel and plug it in and put it on your balcony. So let's not squander this opportunity that this crisis has provided.
Oh yeah, and not just policymakers. I mean, we're seeing it too from different companies, and I'm just hoping this is a moment that consumers can really push for products and changes that they believe in.
Well, with that, let's get to what we can do as individuals.
Mhm.
Already some great discussion there. Let's take Dan's encouragement and become part of the electrical revolution. Take a look at the things that you have in your life that burn fossil fuels and start making a plan about how you're going to phase those out. Whether that's, trying to make your own electricity, putting solar on the roof, replacing your internal combustion engine with an e-bike or with, an EV, swapping out that gas furnace for a heat pump.
Mhm.
I don't know, Thomas, other suggestions for people on ways they can participate in this?
Well, there's a guy here in Australia. Actually, he spends a lot of time in the US too. Sol Griffith, who is famous for saying you can't efficiency yourself to zero, and he has a great point. We need to electrify everything, but at the same time, don't forget about the efficiencies. I.e., make
Agree.
sure your house is insulated. I still come across so many houses with uninsulated walls, and those cavities can be filled with wall infill insulation. So doing that at the
Right.
same time as you do a heat pump conversion, if you're on gas, is a great idea because it reduces the size of the electrical infrastructure that you need to add to the facility.
Yeah, great point on the efficiency piece. It's maybe not as sexy as the new EV, but it is
Yeah, yeah.
equally important, in the long term here. We all need to be consuming less energy and switching to, energy that can be produced, with non-carbon sources.
And for another option for what we can do, you can also volunteer with an organization helping to drive solutions that accelerate our clean energy transition. And there are plenty of amazing organizations that are helping to pave the way. Some of our favorites over at Climate Optimists include the Climate Reality Project, Citizens Climate Lobby, and the League of Conservation Voters. An extra plug for that one right now. I just went and voted in Maryland, and it just feels
Good on
easier
you.
than ever to get online, learn about candidates, figure out what they care about, and make an easily informed decision. So definitely pushing for that right now.
Yeah, great reminder, Flora. We have elections, coming up here. Well,
Mhm.
primaries now and
Yeah.
big elections here in the fall, and it's on us to make sure that this is part of the dialogue and forcing candidates to, state their positions.
And of course, as always, if you're here in our hometown of Portland, Oregon, please come join us. Head over to the website, climateoptimist.co, and click our contact button, and we will reach out with future projects and information.
Thanks, Flora. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks again to Dan Walter from Ember. If this is the first time you're hearing about Ember, take a minute to go check out their website. They're truly an authority on the clean energy revolution, very data driven. So yeah, it's a frequent one for me.